Hi, my name is Charles Miano, investment analyst, Nabo Capital.
And I'm Isaac Kamau, investment associate at Nabo Capital.
And you're watching the watch list. So firstly, we'll be covering Egypt and touching a little bit on the last tranche that they received this week from the IMF. As we know, IMF came in November 2016
Yes.
when Egypt was in a whole load of mess, and they're getting the final tranche. What are your thoughts on this?
I think it's been quite the journey. If you look at where they were in 2016 and where they are today, they've really managed to turn the economy around with the support and guidance of the IMF. One of the issues they really had was fiscal expenditure. They really were spending quite a bit and spending it inefficiently. And the IMF has really helped them reorient that, take away some of the expenditure that wasn't really adding so much to the economy, and prioritizing the more important areas of expenditure. And I think that's been one of the main benefits of this IMF program. Not just when the IMF comes in, there's a lot of emphasis on the funding support that they give these countries. True. But if you actually think about it, the real benefit comes from sort of having like a sort of headmaster, making sure prefect, making sure you follow the rules and sort of implement the policies which are good in the long term for your economy, but which might not feel so good in the short term. I think the perfect example is the subsidies that they have been taking off slowly. It's something that in the short term might not feel so good. I mean, your fuel is going to cost more, your bread might cost more, but it eventually gives the government more room to spend more on building roads and supporting the manufacturing base of the country, which helps the country in the long term. But overall, I think the program was fairly successful.
I totally agree with you, especially if we touch on the currency and the impact of that. They had multiple sort of, you can say, parallel currencies. There's a thriving black market. And then with the coming of the IMF, then we did see that convergence. Yes, there was that short-term pain that they had to endure, where the currency almost doubled to 16, 17 levels to the US dollar. But we've seen stability in the currency. It's one of the, you can say, better performing currencies with regard to gaining against the dollar, especially in the last maybe 24 months. So that's been great for the currency.
It has been very, very stable. Since the devaluation in November 2016, it hasn't gotten out of that band of 16 to 17.8. It stayed within that range throughout the entire period. And I think that's also been very beneficial to them.
Yeah, and I also think in regard to just building up the buffers as well. If you look at the FX reserves, they are all-time high. If you look at Egypt historically, and they've been, I think, on the back of having IMF, there's been investor support. We've seen the local market thrive quite a bit. The local treasury bills being one of the highest yielding in the African space. So I think now the question just remains, what will they do post IMF? And we've seen a lot of most of the countries which have gotten support from IMF typically go back to they run into problems and then call back IMF. So hopefully Egypt can be a different story from that. It's something that we'll have to be patient around, but I think at the moment the government has put in place the measures, as you mentioned earlier, to take the country in the right direction. So and I think IMF will be to some extent maybe assisting them, maybe not directly through the program, but I think they'll still be working hand in hand. It could be
the consultations,
exactly, which I think will be continuing.
Typically it's on an annual basis. If you're working closely with the IMF, typically they would come in once a year just to offer some advice to the local policymakers. And like you mentioned, it's very important that they stick to this path. Just to sustain that growth that they've really experienced in the last couple of years, because it's not only been the currency and investor confidence which have really been impacted, but actual economic growth has improved substantially since then. I think that was a fairly successful program. keeping within the same region, this week there was some unfortunate news of the passing of the president of Tunisia.
Okay.
He was 92 years old. I think he's one of the few leaders who actually delivered on like the Arab Spring,
Okay.
right? If you look at Tunisia, it's been one of the few countries which actually successfully, during that period, went from an absolute dictatorship to a democracy, where now there are protests like within the streets, and the authorities are somewhat, you know, allowing that to happen, and creating that room for an actual political discourse within the country. I think that's probably his most important legacy, just being able to sort of guide and shepherd the country through this transition. That's been his main legacy. It's unfortunate. There's this, I think, now brings to the front the question of political risk and succession in that country. They were having an election this year in October, which he said, October and November, parliamentary presidential, which he said he's not intending to run in. I don't think his death changes the timetable much, given under the constitution. Okay. The speaker takes control as the temporary president for a period of 90 days, and then they have the election. So that 90 days would expire around about when they would have had the election anyway. But I think this just sort of brings that political succession question to the front of investors' minds as well.
Yeah, and also touching on Tunisia as well. It's under an MF program.
Yes,
well.
yes, the under an MF program.
I think maybe the story hasn't been elaborated as much as Egypt, just given maybe where Egypt is, given the population, given the size of the GDP being top 3 significant
within
large
Africa.
place within Africa, including South Africa and Nigeria as well. So it's in that space. So Tunisia has sort of been muted. But again, I think developments there have been relatively positive, but not to the extent we'd say with Egypt. I know there are some worries, but I think largely with where politically it is right now, as you mentioned, the elections coming in, we don't expect to see a drastic change in maybe the regime changes, but not a drastic change in policy. I think so. I think the policy still will remain, especially when it comes to fiscal consolidation, being a key thing, and maybe pushing for growth as well.
The IMF program is set to expire shortly after the election, around April next year. I think they've had a moderately successful program, but again, the question remains: what will they do after the program? Will there be an ongoing relationship with the IMF, or will it be they pack their bags and leave? And that now might cause some slippage in terms of government spending and some of the policy making decisions within that country. I think it's interesting.